Hello there. My name is Andre Darmanin, and I'm the host of the newly rebranded Global Conversations. I was supposed to have a co-host today, Priya Rateja, but unfortunately she couldn't make it today, so I'm going solo today. So today's conversation will be on inclusive leadership, and we talk about inclusive leadership quite a bit. And in terms of leadership styles, in terms of what is comprised of inclusive leadership, but how does that look when it comes to an equity, diversity, inclusion landscape, as well as I want to tack that on into the fact of looking at it from a global perspective. There's a localized perspective and also the globalized perspective in terms of those organizations that have global EDI. So for those watching, I just want to introduce, first of all, two of my guests who I've had the pleasure of knowing for the last, year and a half virtually, if you will, and that's still the case in our environment. But of course, these are the conversations that we're still having till today, until, one of us travels to each other's places and meet at conferences or whatever. But, be that as it may. So before anything, let me begin by introducing my two guests. First, Nadia Nagamootoo she's the founder and CEO of Avenir Consulting. And secondly, we have here Jenny Vazquez-Newsum, the founder and CEO of Untapped Leaders. And I'll go into the whole conversation of how we met, and, what brings us together, et cetera. And then, we'll get into our conversation. So first I want to, before I begin, I like to recognize that this episode is being recorded on the traditional territories of the Mississauga of the Credit, and the peoples of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat, and it is covered under Treaty 13 and Treaty 13 and the Williams Treaties. And where I'm broadcasting from is also the home of the First Nations, including the Métis and the Inuit peoples. So with that, I just want to get some ideas and have the audience get some ideas as to who you are. So Nadia, let's start with you, since you're the furthest. Well, actually, no, I'm probably in the middle, so I'm probably equidistant to the both of you. So Nadia, yeah. So Avenir Consulting. I mean, well, actually, let me go back for a second. First, you and I met at that Icon Inclusion Conference virtually, mm-hmm. And it was such a while ago. It was like, okay, Nadia was so eloquent in what she was talking about. And I believe the conversation was about inclusive leadership yourself. And so it was like, hey, you know what? Maybe this is a topic that we like to talk about, especially when we're looking at it from, global equity and inclusion. So, and then of course I approached you last summer, and here we are now finally getting together. So, as I'm thinking about the word avenir, which is, the coming or the future. So that's right. What does that future look like for you? And, and then expand, tell my audience about who you are and why you're passionate about equity and inclusion and belonging and whatnot. So go ahead.
Thank you very much, Andre. So yeah, so avenir does indeed mean future. And I thought it was really apt when, thinking about the company name, because diversity, equity, inclusion is all about what we're aiming for, what we're all striving for a different future for our children and our children's children. And, hopefully if we're still on this planet, when things do change, we'd like the speed of change to be quicker, but for the future to be one where everyone can feel like they belong, and everyone can feel that no matter their difference, that they have a place in the world, in society, in their organization, wherever they may be. And so my background from a professional perspective is as a chartered occupational or business psychologist, and I've been practicing that for 20 odd years. Here in the UK, working with global clients, mind you, a lot of work in leadership development, facilitation, culture change, transformation, and I'm also an accredited coach and have an MBA. So that's a little bit about what it says on paper. My passion for diversity, equity, inclusion certainly I entered the space because I realized the inequity coming from it from a gender perspective. Initially, actually, I entered the space looking at the inequity between male caring responsibility, so men stepping into their caring responsibilities, and how that impacts women and their career progression, assuming heterosexual relationships. And so a lot of my research initially was investigating how organizational culture and leadership can influence men in their decision to take an active caring role, to lean into that, despite going against what we as society, certainly in the Western culture, expect of men, to be the provider, to be the main earner of the for the family. We don't expect them to be caring, sensitive. That's not the stereotypes, the labels that we put on men. And so it causes real problems then when we're trying to create gender equity or gender parity or balance within organizations. So this is what I was initially, so I did a lot of keynote speaking in that area, and then really broadened from there, leaning on my psychology, the concepts of privilege, bias, structural advantage, equality, equity, all of the stuff that we talk about. It lends itself really well to my background. And so Avenir and everyone that works for Avenir all can offer that that insight into our values, our beliefs, the emotions that we carry, how that plays out when we're trying to navigate this complexity of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thanks for that, Nadia. Listening to that story of how you formed your organization is it's telling. It tells a story, and it's it shows your passion to the work that you do, and I really appreciated that. And now, Jenny, what can I say about you, Jenny? Look, we've known each other for a few, I guess the same amount of time, 2 years. And, I've been a fan of your work for the longest time. And I've already expressed this to you many times. And, and then of course, you started Untap Leaders. And, and one of the posts that I remember you talking about is, what does leadership look like? And when you started to look at specifically, who are the authors that we start to see? And they're mainly white men, right? So, we're going based on white supremacy, white culture, white leadership, etc. So you wanted to bring to light this, and this is a conversation that I've always wanted to have too, of what does our leadership look like in such a global, multicultural society? So, and then of course, after we had the conversation, I believe you started your Untap Leaders after working, I believe it was with a nonprofit organization before that. So, and now you've gone full throttle with this, and and I admire your leadership in this space. And so, so for the audience, I've already kind of spoiled it here, but you've got a lot of a background for you. So yeah. Tell us more about yourself and how you got to where you're at, although I've, spoken about some of it, but the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having me. I am in California, so I am US based in Los Angeles and Tongvad land, original Tongvad land. And my career has been in leadership development, in education. My background is in education, and I've always worked in kind of facilitating spaces for leaders at different stages of their careers, from high school students to executives, kind of finding their place and space in what they want to do. So really kind of exploring their own careers and their own career paths. Having spent a few decades facilitating leadership frameworks, studying leadership frameworks, I could really, in even my doctoral classes, taking a leadership course and realizing that the syllabus was fully only white men written and driven. I came to this realization really in 2020, which I think was very much a core shaking year for a lot of us. And I think on the heels of George Floyd's murder here in the US, really thinking about this question of how do I want to spend my time and talent on this earth? And thinking about, where would I have the most impact in understanding kind of what my knowledge is and what I can bring to the world, and then what we're not seeing. And so it really was this realization that I had been, facilitating, kind of making all these white-centered frameworks work, and it wasn't representing me. They weren't written by someone like me or for someone like me. And so that's where this Untapped Leaders work emerged. And so it really actually began with writing the book, Untapped Leadership, which will be out this year. I'm really excited, published a little later. But it's about harnessing the power of underrepresented leaders, about harnessing the power that we've overlooked, that we haven't written about, that hasn't been named. And I think there's, these realities of leadership that are happening in organizations and a lot of spaces that we don't talk about because, we haven't had the power of the pen or the power of the microphone in the past few centuries. So that's where this Untapped Leadership work has really emerged. And really what I'm hoping to do is amplify, how marginalized perspectives and those that kind of have been overlooked are actually what's needed for the future we want to see. Like the leadership that we need sits in those margins, sits in that kind of experience of having been marginalized, actually gives you a lot of tools and strengths to lead from. So that's where the work sits now. And I really work now through community. We have a group that we work with through Untapped Leaders, as well as coaching and kind of those aspects that we do. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
And thanks for that, Jenny. And, just listening to both of your stories where you're talking about, the marginalization and trying to create an inclusive, workplace, or inclusive, just inclusivity in general, I would say. This is something that, I'd like to explore a little more on. So let's start the conversation between the both of us here. Now, when we've talked about inclusive leadership, we all branch out in terms of, what does inclusive leadership look like? Does it merge with other areas such as transformational leadership, servant leadership, et cetera? And Jenny, we had a conversation probably last month where I remember I had a talk with somebody about, servant leadership trumps inclusive leadership. And then I took issue with that conversation. So, and that's why I reached out to you about this. And so, what does inclusive leadership look like to both of you? Feel free to start the conversation, anybody. And also, what does that look like from a global perspective? So the floor is yours. Whoever wants to start here, and I'm sure you have a passion to answer this question. Anybody can go ahead.
I'm happy to jump in just to get us going. I think there's like this baseline definition maybe of inclusive leadership as, you are a leader that is valuing and incorporating diverse perspectives in your leadership. You are creating space where people feel like their contributions carry weight, that they are important, that the way they see the work, the way they operate are all valued and welcomed into a space. I think what we'll maybe hopefully get into is kind of the nuance and the layers of what true inclusion requires. And I think there's a difference between inclusion and belonging. And so you can be included, but that doesn't necessarily equate to belonging. And so I think when we start to unpack what true inclusive leadership means, I really think that we should kind of dig a few layers below. But if we want to have this standard definition, that's what I would start off with.
And thanks, Jenny. That's absolutely, I would concur with that, but also that sense of self-understanding is so critical. So their open-mindedness, their willingness to explore who they are, to learn about themselves, to educate themselves about other people and history and everything that's come before, how that influences how people walk through the world and how people experience the world, and therefore how the world interacts with them. So there's this sense of deep curiosity that allows them, and this is quite key, and actually something that I'm writing in my book, Beyond Discomfort, which will be, I know, 2 authors, all around being able to sit with discomfort. Being uncomfortable is something that we rarely, as humans, we want to sit in for long. And yet being an inclusive leader requires us to acknowledge some of the things that we deeply would not want to see in ourselves or see in the world around us, and acknowledge that what was our reality and has been, which hits to the core of who we are and that we fundamentally believe in, might not apply to everyone. And this is shocking for some people, and yet to sit with that discomfort and then make the decision, that means I have to do something different. That means that the archetypal leader that I have been striving for, yeah, even playing to some of you just mentioned servant leadership, transformational leadership, you know, we can reel off all of these other theories of leadership
Defined by white men too, mind you.
Say again.
Defined by white men as well.
Right. Right. So we could go into, we could unpick all of that in terms of power, couldn't we? And what makes a leader, but to actually hold that light with lightness and say, even though I've got loads of feedback that I'm a good leader and I've progressed in my career and people have told me that it's because I'm such a good leader, it's possible I still have more to learn and I haven't been as inclusive as I thought I might be. That is such a hard pill to swallow, and it's uncomfortable as anything, and they've got to sit with that and do something different.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And you know, it's funny because all the qualities that you mentioned about inclusive leadership, it actually intertwines with, there was a graphic that I saw, I'll share it in the show notes, of, inclusive leadership being one component of 8 characteristics of a leadership model. Inclusive leadership was one of them. And what you've also described was certainly cultural intelligence, especially when you're looking at it from a global perspective of understanding cultures and whatnot. So, and let's go back and unpack that conversation that you had, Jenny, about, as equity practitioners, we have these titles: equity, diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity, diversity, inclusion, belonging, idea, all these acronyms together, which sometimes I find it's just like word candy, or you know what I mean, or letter candy, or alphabet soup. That's really what it is. Yeah. And so, let's go back for a second and talk about this, the difference between inclusion and belonging, and why we need to differentiate that within organizations, within our practices. And let's talk about that a little more.
Yeah, I think, every time I think about kind of inclusion, I tweeted about this recently because thinking about in preparation for this conversation, I think about the power dynamic that's embedded within inclusion. So there's always an includer. There's someone that is including, or a group that is including, and then there's those that are included. And so, there is this exchange that inclusion creates where there are usually leaders and folks that have a lot of formal authority, that have a lot of power, make the choice, the decision to include others. And in that, we have to think about, well, does that create a sense of belonging there? I don't think so. I think we have to really think about, how can you diffuse power so that, those that are being included are actually the ones shaping the way things get done, or the way things, our decisions are being made. And so really kind of adjusting and unpacking a bit beyond inclusion, and not feeling like, okay, we have an inclusive environment, and that's it. I don't think that really does it. And so I think of an example. I worked at a prior organization, and it was a particularly challenging work environment. I was included, I was included, but it wasn't necessarily a space that I wanted to be included into. Like, it was very challenging to navigate. And so that didn't feel like a sense of belonging for me. I couldn't bring my full self to that space. And so I think they, as leaders, as equity consultants, as all the folks kind of doing this work, we really have to think about, really getting clear on what the inclusion is into, and are we just kind of including into white dominant spaces, or just spaces that are kind of have been created by others that aren't like us, and how does that actually create belonging?
Nadia, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I'm listening to Jenny and thinking, you definitely a distinction between the two. I sort of feel that inclusion, you can include me, right? But unless I see it replicated across, the belonging happens when you see it culturally embedded within the organization. So it's okay if some people feel included and they feel that there's inclusion in the organization, they might eventually get a sense of belonging. But that psychological safety that you get from knowing that anyone in the room is included, has a voice around the table, is appreciated for who they are. It isn't just you and I suppose, because we're all coming with our unique identity and our unique characteristics. And so if I feel that I'm appreciated for who I am, but the person sitting next to me in my team doesn't, and I see that overtly being displayed, then I'll always offer me a sense of unease that, okay, well, if that's how they're treated, will the tables be turned on me one day? So belonging is this deeper sense. It's much deeper than inclusion. Inclusion is more of an act, and belonging is the feeling. It's a feeling that I trust this organization, or this, wherever I am, I trust that you'll hold this incredibly precious part of me that I rarely share with other people, and that my colleagues around me can do the same, and that we'll all be allowed to do that without fear of negative judgments or consequences as a result of that. So I feel that the belonging is the feeling of the act.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, because, as you look at, or even, if clients come to you and say to you, add inclusive leadership into a job description or something, but do they really understand what inclusive leadership means? And do they really understand what belonging means? And that is, and I find that this is an issue that we have in our organizations, is that we just, like I mentioned before, we just throw out these words without, HR or anyone really understanding what they mean for an organization. It's just, a lot of times it's, here's the bare bones of, what you become as a leader, but are you really enacting and providing that sense of belonging for that person? Because, like you said, Jenny, earlier, is like, you're included at a table, but do you really feel belong at that table, given the nature of the conversation or the topic, et cetera? So, and I want to unpack something with you, Nadia, a little bit too, about what we were talking about earlier with respect to, the cultural differences and whatnot. And I find with global organizations, you have to put into the mind of the cultural differences and how they approach gender or how they approach sexual identity or anything like that. So how does one become an inclusive leader in that type of environment where you're looking at various, you're working with clients from other countries who have different ideals, different values that don't match the typical Western culture? How do you tell someone that this is what it looks like as an inclusive leader? Do you have the same characteristics? Do you have to modify it or whatnot? This is something that I'm curious about.
It's such a good question, and one that I toy with a lot as well when working with global organizations that have, across regions, like properly global offices where they have a global diversity, equity, inclusion strategy policy, and are trying to navigate how in some of the countries where they might operate, for example, being a part of the LGBTQ+ community would be illegal. And it's really challenging, because at the core of that organization comes a particular value set, which is that we want to be inclusive, and certainly being part of the LGBTQ+ community in the head office, of that global organization, wherever that lie, it wouldn't be illegal. So, and we would want everyone to feel that they belong and feel that we've created this inclusion for them. They're part of this organization and they feel safe in this organization, no matter where they live. However, there is something that's very tricky to navigate, the complexity of this, which is that doesn't mean we can swoop in to individual countries and say, well, look, you've got it wrong. These people should be allowed to demonstrate their love in different ways and demonstrate their sexuality or their gender in different ways. That's not possible to do. And so there's this really tricky navigation of being conscious of the local culture and the local laws and values, whilst inviting people to the global events to allow people to be part of an organization that they feel included. So there's a distinction between the organization and the country level. And I think that if you blur the two, it becomes really, really tricky. So it's about respecting the country that local people are in, whilst also inviting them and making sure that they're part of an organization that values them for who they are. Not an easy one to do, not an easy one, but making sure that you have local DEI strategies so that you're not imposing from a global lens, not imposing on local satellite offices or however big they might be, imposing your DEI strategy, hoping that it's going to fit and work for everyone there, because they just won't feel like they've been seen or heard. So sort of multiple layers of creating inclusion globally, I think.
Jenny, I'm sure you've got a lot to add to this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. I love that, Nadia, because it is the reality of context, I think, is a big piece of this. I think in my Untapped Leaders work, I talk a lot about this contextual agility that's required in leadership, that, what works for me may not work for you. What works today may not work tomorrow. And, what works here in the US may not work in the UK, may not work abroad. Like that, we need to sit with and start with that assumption. Like that is just kind of the basis from which we should think about our decisions. And so that idea of, from a global perspective, then kind of bringing it down to all of these different locales or just regions, and just assuming that is the way to do it, and that this is how we do inclusive leadership, that almost feels counterproductive. Like it's counterintuitive, like that you are now excluding in that process because it's not taken into account, like in the context, in the different contexts of our world, and where the world is. And so that resonates quite a bit for me. And thinking about on the global perspective and kind of global scale, kind of going back to what you talked about a little earlier, Nadia, this, our cultures are so embedded in us, our norms are so embedded in us that we sometimes just assume that that is how things go, that's the way things are. We only see that around us, and so that's reality. And so I think when we're thinking really on a global scale on inclusion and kind of these efforts, is challenging that for yourself directly. That, I may not have all the answers. I should not have all the answers. And so then how do I start from there to then do the work? Another piece I wanted to just mention is I think there's going back to Andre, your idea of like folks put these on job descriptions, like inclusive leadership, these terms and these words that are kind of buzzwords. They read nicely, they sound good. And I think what we miss in that, I think it's important to name these things, that these are values, but what we miss is the necessity for kind of the micro moments and decisions that build to actually inclusive leadership. That's all the stuff that you don't see, or you don't, really, it's not kind of the big event or the big, month that we're celebrating LGBTQ workers or Black workers, like it's not, that's one piece of it, but what is the micro moments, the day-to-day experience, and what are your day-to-day decisions that are creating inclusive workplaces or inclusive environments, and how are you doing that internal work that is baseline requirement, that self-awareness, your own biases, checking those that no one is seeing outwardly, but you need to do. That's inclusive leadership, and that's really kind of just a requirement that we don't want to miss when we talk about the big nice phrases that we use in this work. So
yeah, no, that's that's great. And it gives me some thoughts about like the performative nature of what we talk about. We talk about upcoming here in North America, Black History Month, and I know in the UK, I believe it passed late last year. And so what we're forgetting is that, things like, South Asian Heritage Month or Caribbean Heritage Month or Black History Month, what we're forgetting is that happens 365 days a year, right? That's the conversation we need to have in these arguments. And the fact that, and the other thing that kind of has always bugged me in these types of conversations is, I might be going off on a little tangent here, but this talk about diversity training, right? If we're training our leaders, regardless of your profession, to understand differences, which is the basic norm of differences based on your abilities or based on your what you do or what you bring to the table when it comes to your work. And then on top of that, the cultural differences, like diversity training is something that's, is it really needed anymore? And should we start talking about it from the perspective of maybe we need inclusive leadership training, for instance, or we need a different type of training involved in these, in our work environments, right? So, I mean, maybe this is something that's different than the norm in what we're seeing in equity inclusion circles. Is there merit to what I'm saying, or do you disagree with what I'm saying? Like,
So I guess I'm taken aback in the sense that for me, we sort of ditched diversity training a little while ago, maybe back sort of early 2000s, where and maybe the training itself hasn't changed significantly. Maybe it has. We've moved away from pure kind of unconscious bias training, for example, which is what people would typically know as diversity training. Diversity is about the numbers, right? It's about how many people do we have of different ethnic backgrounds, for example, or different genders or whatever. How many do we have? And so it's about so when I hear the term diversity training, it's just about teaching people about difference. teaching people that they have these unconscious biases, for example, but it tells them nothing. It doesn't help them in any way, shape or form around the emotionally, how to navigate that, what to do when you meet difference, how you can successfully create relationships with when you have polarizing views, or share things, recognize that you have things in common, but also understand that there are things that you will always probably differ on, but still get along and still be able to work together and appreciate another person's perspective. The diversity training doesn't get you there. It just tells you, it's just offering some content. And so that's where the criticism around unconscious bias training has always been, that it just leaves people with this understanding of, oh, well, everyone's got bias, so that's okay then, and so they don't do anything about it anyway. Or, oh, so I'm holding all these biases, so what am I meant to do with that? And either made to feel guilty or ashamed of holding those, and it's not helpful neither way, whether they think it's acceptable because everyone has them, or they're shamed into having them. Neither is very productive or helpful. So the way that workshops, facilitated programs have gone is very much leaning on three main elements. This is certainly the core of Avenir's inclusive leadership program, where we offer a very experiential approach. So really getting people to step out of their own shoes, understand someone else's perspective. So really engaging in the conversation, navigating difficult and challenging conversations through role play, case studies, simulation exercises, getting them to really think how their own lens of the world has influenced how they see other people, how they view themselves, their perspective of meritocracy and whether that exists. So really challenging some core aspects of people's belief systems, which is not easy, but also supporting them with understanding what they then need to do with that. So the how can you be a more inclusive leader? What are the skills that you need to develop, the approach and the practices that you need to take that might feel uncomfortable, but is important to continue practicing, getting them to practice that in the sessions, really important, so that you don't just say, well, this is how you do it, and leave them to it. So actually getting them to practice having that, and actually really getting them to understand the what do they then do with that, some action, some understanding their role to be active allies in this, and what that, it's so easy to throw the word active allyship around. What does that mean? And how do I want that to apply to me in my organizational context? What is my role in breaking down inequities and power structures in my organization that I might not have seen before, but now realize they exist? And so I have this accountability to do something about it. So for me, the sheep dip, diversity training, and just getting people to go through and come out the other side knowing something but not knowing what to do is very unhelpful. The program we run is over a period of several months, 4 to 6 months, because this isn't a quick fix. This is inner work that leaders need to do within themselves and together, so that they feel like that they have people around them who are also on this journey together and can experience it together and know how to challenge each other. So for me, progress happens when you don't just kind of support one leader, but it's a team. Everyone's experiencing it, everyone's sharing, and everyone's understanding how to approach inclusion in the organization.
And before you respond or add to the conversation, it reminds me of 3 separate authors that we talk about in this conversation. We have Rohini Anand when we're talking about global DEI perspectives. You have Amy Edmondson when we're talking about the Fearless Organization, and then I forgot who the third one is, but anyway, John Amici. when we're talking about that bias trainings. He's the one who's talked about that, incessantly, saying conscious bias training is useless, right? And you've added to that, just like everyone's talking about diversity training is just checking the box, right? So Jenny, I mean, I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts on this, and to add to what Nadia said.
Yeah, I agree. I think there can be something particularly almost harmful in doing a check the box diversity training, check the box unconscious bias training, because then you feel like you've made progress, or organizations like, okay, we've done it, and then no other work happens, and that is pretty damaging, I'd say, long run. So I think, to your question around should we let go of the diversity training, move to inclusive leadership training, or really, I think what highlights for me is that I am always interested in going a few levels deeper into the conversation, into the realities, into the context, again, of what is happening. We're having this quote unquote diversity training, but why are we actually having this quote unquote diversity training? So with the work that I do with Untapped Leadership, I often get a question around, is it equity work? Is it inclusion work? Is it diversity work? And I honestly, I say, no, it's leadership work, but the systems are inequitable. And so this is what I'm trying to do. So it's not necessarily that I'm doing leadership for racially marginalized groups, or I'm doing leadership that only represent racially marginalized groups. That's not it. We're talking about leadership at this point. And I think what is required of leadership at this point is this understanding of our different contexts, of the different people that come to work and their full selves and their full experiences, and just kind of the realities of living in this world today, and how we can create organizations that are, naturally equitable, like they're just kind of morphing and moving towards the goals that we want to see, that are not going to be done through a one-off session, and has to be in the bones. And so I'm always interested in kind of getting to the bones, the structures of the work, and I really go at it through the point of leadership, that if we are going to actually talk about leadership, then we should be talking about all the ways everyone is leading in their own from their own perspectives, their own ways, their own context, and it's not necessarily just sitting within a dominant culture of leadership that then kind of creates this need for a diversity training, that, what I mean? So that's what I appreciate that question, because I want organizations and our spaces to let's go down to the foundation, let's dig at the structures, because that's where the change happens.
No, that's great. And listening to the both of you just talking about really digging in to figure out where our biases are, and how do we improve it, and having those uncomfortable conversations. So as we conclude here, I just want to just get an insight for our viewers here. I know we touched about it at the beginning, Nadia, you had mentioned it, but what are those real skills and characteristics of someone who should strive to be that inclusive leader, period? So Nadia, I know you touched on it, but I mean, you can expand on what you've said, and then Jenny, you can add to it as well.
So for me, there needs to be an openness to really learning about themselves. I think it has to start there. I don't know any diversity, equity, inclusion practitioner, professional who doesn't believe that the work starts there. Because if you enter the space thinking that what the world, what reality is, right? I was just chatting earlier today, and I was saying, look, if they're so fixed that the trees are green, right, and they see just green trees, they've been told trees are green, they've always colored trees as green when they were little kids, right? they see that to be so grounded and fixed that trees can't be any other color, that I see trees as purple, right? That is so important, to be able to have that open-mindedness, even though it might not be my reality and I actually can't see how it's possible. I still remain open that you see that those trees are purple. And I think that that's what we're tackling here, is this this ability to flex and be open and be curious, and to acknowledge that the way that I experience the world and how I walk through this world is based on so many aspects, like layers upon layers of who I am, my belief system, my values, my educational background, my upbringing, you know, everything that I was taught. And it creates how I interpret the world, how I observe the world, and therefore how the world interacts with me. And that because someone else there's only one person who has the specific layers that I do, right, in terms of my identity, my cultural background. Not even my brother has exactly the same as I, right? Not possible. We're all unique. So therefore I must be open-minded to understand there's a possibility that the world would interact with someone else differently. And if we can get everyone just a little bit towards acknowledging that is the way that the world works, right? And accepting that, therefore, the structures that we live in are biased towards certain people. And that means that some people have more of a positive experience of the world compared to others, and therefore that might lead to better outcomes for them. Yeah. If we can get leaders there, that's an amazing start, I would say.
Excellent. Jenny?
Yes, I would echo. Number one is that self-awareness, self-reflection, and just knowing that that's kind of a lifelong practice. You never just get it. I'm always working. I do this work every day, and I'm always unpacking, always, trying to realize where I default to a bias, and then that's there. To add to that, I think what is also required is time for that. So I think we do live in a world that's always on, always going. The pace is frenetic at the moments, and to do this work well, it requires space. It requires a pause to have that moment to unpack. Okay, well, what behaviors did I do today that excluded others, or where was I not aware of what I was doing, or just kind of doing what I always do. And so I think as leaders, we have to pace a bit to interrupt our propensity to go back to what we know, and that's hard. Again, Nadia, you talk about, like, there is a friction that happens when we get information that does not align with what we've experienced and what we know and what our culture and our norms. And so you have to give that time to enter in. Otherwise, our brains are wired to just click it, kick it back out and keep it moving, because we got to get things done. We got to get things done the way we know to get them done. And so a lot of this work, as we've talked about, kind of just that space and time, I think is a big piece of it. So for anyone listening, really thinking about that self-reflection is step one, and then really being strategic in building out your time and space to bolster that self-awareness that you're working on. So,
I've learned so much from the both of you. Outside of our sidebar conversations on social media, like I said, I've learned so much from this conversation, and I'm pretty sure that, potential leaders, equity practitioners, equity inclusion practitioners, however, whoever's listening to this is and watching this is going to learn a lot from this and take away a lot of this conversation. So right now, we're just going to end by, just telling us more about yourself, telling us how to find you, and even the shameless plug for your books. So so Jenny, start with you, and then Nadia, we'll conclude with you.
Let me tell you, it's not shameless at this point. This book is needed, and I worked hard. So yes, so you can find more about Untapped Leaders at www.untappedleaders.com. And the book, it will be out June 2023, but you can pre-order now. There's a link on the website as well. It's Untapped Leadership, Harnessing the Power of Underrepresented Leaders.
And you can find me on most social channels, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, at Nadia Nagamootoo. The website is avenirconsultingservices.com. And I also have a podcast show called Why Care, which is coming up to the end of season 3. And some incredible people, I have to say, that I have had the privilege of speaking to. My book is called Beyond Discomfort, Why Inclusive Leadership is So Hard and What You Can Do About It. And unlike Jenny, it is still a work in progress. It's a decent work in progress, but it still is. So I'm imagining end of 2023, early 2024, all going to plan. And absolutely will post about it on social channels. So follow me and you'll hear more about it.
Nadia, Jenny, thank you for this conversation. I really appreciate it. And I'll end by saying, and I should have said it before, but I'll say it now, is at the time of this taping of this recording, happy Lunar New Year to those celebrating, and coming up, happy Black History Month for those celebrating in North America. And so with that, I bid you adieu, and thanks for this conversation, and see you next time.
Thank you, Andre.
Thank you.